beekeepers will feed their bees actually corn syrup, which is a horribly toxic, highly refined thing, which is causing a lot of problems, and I think probably suppressing their immune systems to the point where disease can spread much more rapidly and readily than it should ever be able to. So, of course, I'm not going to use corn syrup. Normally, bees in the wild will eat honey, and that's all they eat. Some beekeepers are in the nasty bad habit of taking every last drop of honey out of their hives and then feeding the bees on sugar water for the rest of the time. And I think that's a very bad habit. Not only can that sometimes get in the honey, although if you time it right, then the bees will just eat it and not make honey out of it for when it gets to harvest time. But still, I think that does reduce their immunity some too. It certainly does in humans. If I have just ordinary white refined sugar, just as it sits in by most people's coffee makers or in little white bags in their pantries, if I have that from any source at all, I will start feeling like I'm getting a cold within 2 to 3 hours. And of course, if I jump right on it and use my herbs and do a sweat bath and a juice fast, then I can usually reverse that and I never get the cold. But still, sugar is an immunosuppressant, and it makes you more susceptible to things. So I use a unrefined sugar or a less refined sugar. There are a bunch of types out there, and they don't seem to have that immunosuppressant effect. So I'm going to just leave enough honey on my hives for the bees to feed themselves over winter. And of course, when the nectar is flowing in the spring and summer and somewhat into the fall, depending on where you live, they'll make enough food for themselves, but you need to make sure to leave enough honey on over the winter. And depending on where you live, that can be anywhere from 20 to 60 pounds of honey. But I think in Colorado we go between 40 and 60 because we can have some pretty long winters here. I did hear that the groundhog didn't see a shadow this year, so maybe we'll get lucky. Actually, I just... This is completely random, but I wanted to know how accurate Punxsutawney Phil was at predicting an early spring, and apparently he's 39% accurate, which actually you would get a better accuracy flipping a coin, but 39% is pretty good for a groundhog, so kudos to him for that. So maybe we'll get lucky this year, and it is a fun little thing that I just have fun with every February 2nd, and take it with a grain of salt and see what happens. But maybe we'll get lucky this year. And let's see, where was I going? Oh, so I'm going to feed my bees honey only normally, but sometimes, if there's a drought or a long period without blooms in your area, or if the winter is extra long, sometimes you need to feed them in an emergency like that to keep them from starving to death. So I'm going to be experimenting with a few different less refined sugars. And there's a solid kind of a bee candy called fondant. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I think it's a French word. It's probably fondant or something like that in the native pronunciation. But anyway, Fondant. And that's a solid. It's basically you boil sugar and put a teaspoon of vinegar in there, and sometimes people add a little bit of honey. And by the way, if you feed your bees honey, make sure it's honey that they produced or from one of your other hives that's healthy and it's healthy. Don't feed honey from someone else's hive or from another area or from the supermarket. I wish we could do that, but with all the diseases just running rampant around, it's fairly likely that any other honey you get that's not from your own yard might have disease spores in it, which are completely harmless to humans, but they can destroy your hive. So you don't want to risk that. So just feed them honey that they made or from the hive right next to it, and it's healthy. So, just be aware of that one. I wish we could just get honey from anywhere and there weren't all these diseases running around, but, we got to be careful with them. So... anyhow, I'm going to be experimenting with some less refined sugars. There is one thing that an issue I'm going to try to overcome. Some natural beekeepers will say, don't feed them like brown sugar or things with too much molasses in it because there's some solid particles that they can't digest and it can give them diarrhea and things like that. So Obviously, sugar is not the natural food for bees. That's honey, their own honey. But I'm going to be experimenting with some things and trying to find either a type of sugar that doesn't have the particles that irritate the bees' digestive systems, and also is not so refined that it causes immune problems for them. And I actually, the friend I mentioned before, she's using an unrefined sugar with her bees, and so far it doesn't seem to be causing them any problems at all. So, maybe there are bees that just have stronger digestive systems, like people. Some of us have weakness in that area. Others, they can eat anything and get away with it, and they never have any upset stomachs at all. So maybe bees are that way too. So I'm going to be experimenting with not only other less refined sugars, but also some other things, maybe some different types of fruit juice squeezed fresh from the fruit right there. I have heard, and so I'm going to do some research on this to find out if it's plausible, that peach juice, straight from the peach right now, not from the store, not from concentrate, just fresh from the peach immediately after it's squeezed, is so similar to nectar that that might be one thing that could be looked at as a substitute for the sugar syrup or the fondant. So I'm going to be looking at a bunch of things. I haven't found anything conclusive yet, so I don't want to give you that impression, but I'm going to be experimenting with this a lot and trying to find a better emergency food for bees. And I also want to say a lot of beekeepers feed their bees sugar syrup in emergencies and feed them honey normally, and they don't seem to have a problem. But I think if we can make it a little bit better, why not give the bees an extra advantage? So I'm just going to kind of be going out on a limb and being the pioneer in this area, I guess, because I haven't been able to find anybody else online talking about this. I have heard of one fellow feeding his bees sugar maple sap. That's what they produce maple syrup from. And just the sap, the raw sap, straight from the tree before it goes to be made into syrup. And he says he's having success with that. But I've only found that one place, and I like to get a few different reports from different people before I try something, so I'm going to be looking for that and maybe analyzing the chemical makeup of it and everything. And it doesn't have as much sugar in it as nectar does. So, but the bees do seem to eat it, and they seem to do well on it, according to this one fellow. And so that might be something I would look at. The only thing is, I don't think I really have any sugar maples around. We have some other types of maples here. There may be some sugar maples, but we don't have, big maple syrup producing facilities around. And then you would have to tap the tree to get it anyway. It wouldn't be just available for the bees. But again, emergency food. Normally they just eat honey. So those are some things that I'm just going to be looking at to see if I can find something that's better than sugar syrup or a little closer to nature that will still not cause any problems for the bees. Because just because it comes from nature doesn't mean that it's appropriate in a given situation. So I'm just going to try to find the best emergency food for bees, and maybe I'll end up making a monumental discovery. Who knows? And so that's another thing I'm just going to be experimenting and looking at. And until then, I'm just going to use a less refined sugar. I'll probably experiment with some things like turbinado or Florida crystals, and maybe filtering it a little bit just to make sure there's no particles. Anyway, like I say, my friend has had success with just using regular, pure, unrefined, raw sugar. So, maybe that'll turn out to be good for my bees too. I don't know. Some people say it's not.